Hello, Dr. Greg here with the second video on sugar. Now, this video is going to be about the history or a timeline of where sugar came from, how come it's in our diet, and all that kind of stuff. Each one of these videos, I'm going to give a little tip on how to get off of sugar at the end of each video. I think it's important to understand where our foods have come from historically for us to be able to fight back in terms of getting rid of sugar out of our lives because it's harmful. And we're going to talk about what kinds of harm sugar does to you in other videos. But I want to build a foundation for you to understand where sugar comes from. So here we go. This is just a timeline. So at 8,000 BC, which is about 10,000 years ago, sugar was first developed or discovered by New Guinea, first domesticated. So sugar plants grew wild, and in New Guinea in 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago, they domesticated it. Now this knowledge of domestication spread throughout Southeast Asia, China, and India. And that's 10,000 years ago. Now at 800 BC, okay, about 2,800 years ago, the first historical reference of sugar comes from China with the mention of Indian sugarcane fields. So India started actually developing sugar. So that's where it kind of came from, New Guinea, then to India, and China mentioned it. Now at 500 BC, Indian manufacturers, and this started making sugar syrup. And this sugar syrup was more easily transportable, and it started with the name. It was called Kanda, and today we call it candy. 300 BC was the first European contact with sugar, and this happened with Alexander the Great and his invasion of India, and the soldiers that came back brought back this powder, which they called honey powder because it was sweet. Now in 400 AD, Imperial Guptas, India, found a way to turn sugarcane juice into granulated crystals. The new form of sugar, again, was easier to transport, which made it one of the primary ingredients or primary trade items for India, was sugar, in Southeast Asia mainly. It hadn't reached Europe significantly yet. Now in 500s, this is now AD, in 500 AD, Buddhist monks from India actually spread this form of sugar to China. And then Indian sailors also spread this form over the Indian Ocean and started spreading the idea of the sugar and the sugar powder because it was easier to use and sweet like honey. Now in the 9th and 10th century, when the Arab agricultural revolution occurred and Muslim expansion occurred, the Muslims they adopted the process of sugar production from India. The Muslims had invaded India and they discovered sugar and they brought it back and they started producing the same kind of plantations and sugar fields that the Indians had. Now, here's where it got into Europe. Around the 13th and the 11th century, during the Crusades, and there were several Crusades, the Crusaders brought back this sugar, which they called sweet salt, because it kind of looked like salt, back to Europe. And what happened was Venetians and Mediterranean trading fleets, once they got this, started trading sugar. And that was the 11th to the 13th centuries. We're not done yet. The 1500s, the first sugarcane plantations were formed in Central America in the 1500s. Early 1600s, a French individual by the name of Olivier de Sierres discovered crystallized sugar in beets. So beet sugar is a form of sugar, right? And he figured out that there was sugar, you can crystallize sugar from beets. Now, the spreading of sugar was very expensive, 18th century, 1700s. Sugar was very expensive and not available to the general public. It was, I had mentioned in the other video, it was for royalty. They actually made statues out of the sugar. But it started becoming popular and also very expensive, which prompted more sugar plantations to increase. Now, here's an interesting link, actually a horrible link. It caused spread of plantations, which actually caused the spread of slavery. Sugar was very expensive. It was a great profit product. So, of course, individuals who wanted to make a profit produced plantations, and they got slaves. Now, in 1801, the first European beet sugar factory was created, and that was created in Germany. It enabled Europe to start producing sugar in vast quantities, making it very popular. Now, around this time, sugar was also heavily taxed, and what happened was that tax was repealed, which made it more affordable, less expensive for individuals, and there was a lot being produced. But unfortunately, it was produced by slavery. So it was a horrible way to make money. Now, also during the 19th century, which is the 1800s, in the early part of the 1800s, sugar slavery was rampant, producing sugar for the world. But after the Civil War, slavery was significantly reduced. But still, sugar wasn't that expensive because there was a lot of sugar plantations throughout the Caribbean, and it was easily accessible to everyone. Now let's talk about the 20th century, which brings us last century. Sugar has become very commonplace and used by everyone. It is in processed foods, it's a preservative, it's actually to get you to eat the processed foods. It is everywhere. You almost can't, the only thing you can prevent eating it is to just eat natural foods like a chicken or fish or whatever. There's no sugar in those, you hope, but there's sugar in lunch meats. There's sugar in salami. There's sugar in cheese. There's sugar in all processed foods. There's sugar in milk. There's sugar in the juice you drink. Obviously, there's sugar in Coca-Cola. There's sugar in Pepsi. All these types of things that you consume without putting sugar on something. I don't use any sugar in my tea, but you drink a lot of things, eat a lot of things that are sugar, not just candy, and not just cookies, and not just cakes. Muffins have a lot of sugar in it, and that's a breakfast food, right? So bacon can have sugar in it. So the 20th century has seen an explosion of sugar consumption. Now, the story doesn't really end there. In 1957, that's when an individual, Richard O. Marshall and Earl P. Koo, K-O-O-I, developed high fructose corn syrup. Now, high fructose corn syrup has been linked to liver disease and a host of other things that I'm actually going to talk about after I talk about sugar. So high fructose corn syrup is another form of sweetener. Fructose is another form of sugar that can actually be very damaging to a lot of muscle parts. Now, Coca-Cola used to have just plain cane sugar, but now most soft drinks have high fructose corn syrup in them. And that's the timeline of sugar. It's a long one, 10,000 years ago till now. Now, here's the tip. This is a tip that has to do with willpower. And what you want to try and do is when you get a craving in between meals for a cookie or a candy bar or a piece of cake, have a glass of water instead. It's worth trying. So when you feel, oh geez, I want that cookie. I had dinner, but now I want a cookie. Have a glass of water. And you have about 5 to 10 seconds to make that decision. So instead of reaching for the cookie, get a nice glass of cold water and just drink it and see what happens. Every time you have that craving, 8 ounces of water. Try it. It may actually work for you. So with that being said, this is Dr. Greg, changing the way we look at health, and I'll see you next time.